It's the week ending Saturday, the 18th of March, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Theresa May reject calls for a second Scottish referendum, a U-turn on national insurance rises for the self-employed, and IKEA accused of exploiting its lorry drivers. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. The big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And with me today from the week's digital team are Arion McNicoll, Elizabeth Carr-Ellis and Jonathan Harwood. And to start the show with her top pick of the week, it's Elizabeth. What have you brought with you?
If you hear something buzzing overhead, my advice is run for cover.
If we are attacked by nuclear weapons, these are the warning sounds you must recognize. First, the attack warning. If an attack is expected, the sirens will sound a rising and falling note like this.
Footage not from this week, thank goodness, but from an early 80s public information film. That's still rather later than I would have expected. And Elizabeth, this is because the Imperial War Museum is reissuing the pamphlet Protect and Survive. Why?
Thankfully, not because we have to stock up with food and water and hide under the staircase. The reason why this got into my head today was 2 days ago I read that Donald Trump is basically giving the CIA the right to attack other countries, to launch drone strikes. He's rolling back more Barack Obama legislation that says the CIA can now designate a country a temporary area of hostility, and therefore it can attack it quite freely as a battlefield.
Well, it can attack it quite freely, except if it gets it dramatically wrong, there is international condemnation.
They don't have to tell you if they've done a strike.
I think the distinction was that under Obama, the CIA was the intelligence gathering service, and then they'd hand over to the military to do the actual assault, whereas now the CIA can deploy its own drones.
And each strike needed presidential approval, didn't it? It had to be signed off by the president himself, and it had to have a less than 5% chance for civilian casualty.
So it's gone back to how it was under George W. Bush.
I think it was only 57 drone strikes under George W. Bush, something like 600 under Obama, so I think it's going to be a lot more than it was under Bush.
I read a report from Mikazenko, who's with the Council of Foreign Relations, and he says under Obama there were strikes once every 5.4 days. So far under Trump, there's been a strike one every 1.125 days. So it's already started growing.
And so is your thinking that we're going to see drones turned into nuclear delivery systems, or is that your...
My thinking is that suddenly we have this huge build-up in militarisation that's going on, not just from Trump, although today he's asked for an extra $54 billion to be spent on defence, even though America wipes out defence spending for the next 7 countries combined. It has the same amount, so he's asked for extra money for it. But they are triumphalising the military in a way that we haven't seen so far before. And this growing jingoism, and it's not just Trump and America. I've seen this when I returned to the UK after living in Spain. I was struck by the amount of jingoism. And so when I saw this Protect and Survive, I truly thought, oh my God, this is the case we're getting to. I went back to my childhood in the 80s and being very, very worried about what the future might hold military-wise.
But we've had some pretty gung-ho leaders of the free world before, haven't we? And mutually assured destruction ultimately stopped us from bombing each other. So although I see what you're saying, yes, a president who's a bit more gung-ho, a bit more willing to use drones, might lead us down a path towards something like the Protect and Survive scenario. Historically, we never quite got there. So even with Trump and Putin and North Korea, is it going to get that bad?
We've never actually got to midnight, but all that's happened is 2 minutes to midnight has moved around the world. Just because it's not happening in Europe anymore, it's just moved to the Middle East now.
Okay, and so are people who follow the advice of the type issued in this pamphlet mad conspiracy theorists, or do you have some sympathy with those who build shelters in their gardens?
I think even in the 80s when Protect and Survive was out there, we knew fine well that wasn't going to happen. We knew fine well.
Well, we always knew, didn't we?
As
far as you speak to my grandmother, and she'll tell you that at school they did fire drills in case the Blitz came. That was never going to protect kids from having a bomb dropped on them either, was it? Hiding under a desk.
I remember growing up in the 80s and actually, being physically scared of the idea of nuclear war. Look at books like When the Wind Blows and Threads and things like that. I mean, it was pretty apocalyptic, actually. I remember sort of looking out the window and imagining what it would be like if I see a mushroom cloud in the distance, and it didn't seem that unreal that it would happen.
That's what worries me so much now, is the rhetoric is getting back to that level. And where the rhetoric goes, there is a tendency to follow, especially when you have the build-up. We've seen it in Eastern Europe. We have a build-up of NATO troops against Russian troops again.
And it's valuable, isn't it, for the Imperial War Museum to be reissuing things like this? I know they've got their centenary at the moment, and they're looking back across the last 100 years of wartime paraphernalia and how it affected both people who were out in the field fighting and civilians back at home. And actually, unless you really engage with that stuff, it's very easy to quickly forget that it was only the 1980s in all our lifetimes that this was going on.
And actually, I suppose this just, youngsters today have never had it so good, really, have they? I mean, my parents would have had gas masks in little boxes in the 40s, and nowadays everyone just let's play Candy Crush Saga rather than worry about imminent destruction.
Well, or let's worry about imminent destruction on social media and turn it into a bit of a meme. I mean, this is the other thing as well, is that, again, if I speak to my grandma about going out whilst the Blitz was happening in London, she makes it sound like it was a right old laugh. I met your grandfather out there and all the young people really enjoyed it and we didn't think anything of having bombs raining down on us. And I always thought, bollocks. Like, obviously it must have been terrifying and you're just saying that in retrospect. But here we are living through a moment where, again, people feel the pages of history turning. They feel something dark might be about to happen. And actually, I'm not going to say it's fun, but there is an element of, you've got to watch the news tonight. You can't believe what Trump said now.
It's a frisson.
There is something compelling about it when you're living in it, isn't there?
And I think there's a great capacity for gallows humour, regardless of how dire the consequences potentially. That said, the consequences of nuclear are pretty extreme.
That's a pretty big one. Yeah. Okay, well, as far as I'm concerned, we don't do points on this, but I think in bringing up a potential nuclear war, Elizabeth has won this week. But Jonathan, what more significant than our imminent destruction do you think this week might be remembered for?
Well, in South Africa, it's been a case of on your marks, get set, stop.
The Commonwealth Games was set to cost South Africa about $600 million. But in one of the world's most unequal countries with so many other spending priorities, that's money the government says it can't justify spending on a sporting event. But it isn't just about the money. South Africa had missed several deadlines and had failed to appoint an organising committee. But the Minister of Sport was combative in reacting to what some see as an embarrassment.
We can't say to our government it must spend money that it does not have. Most definitely we cannot. But we are not in 2010. This is 2017. We are much wiser.
You just heard Fikile Mbalula, South Africa's Minister for Sport, and before that Tanya Page reporting for Al Jazeera from Durban, where the Commonwealth Games, Jonathan, were due to take place.
That's right. They had the 2022 Games lined up. They've been stripped of them by the Commonwealth Games Federation, and this could be the death knell, a lot of people think, for big organised sporting events, like the future of the Olympics, the World Cup, not just the Commonwealth Games, is all very much up in the air at the moment because of the huge costs involved in putting these events on.
But there's no shortage of countries wanting to come forward and give it a go.
There is. This is the thing.
Really?
Durban was unopposed to host the 2022 Games after Edmonton in Canada actually pulled out because the bid was so unpopular locally. The 2024 Olympics had a short list of 5. 3 of them have pulled out. Rome, Hamburg and Budapest have all withdrawn because it's so unpopular. It seems that hosting sports events is becoming a bit of a thing you can only do if you are a slightly despotic country these days. or you've got a...
2012 seemed to go all right from my point of view.
It did.
Was that despotic?
Well, it was 3 times over budget.
Described Lord Coe?
Well, some might. But subsequent, look at what's happening. We've got Beijing to Winter Olympics in 2022. You've got Qatar World Cup in 2022. You've got...
Just had Russia, of course, as well.
Yeah, Russia in 2018.
Yeah.
These are not sort of small countries trying to host a nice party. These are states that want to make a political point with what they're doing.
Well, on that point, isn't that what these big sporting events were always about, really? If you're going to host them, it's not just because you like games, is it? It's because even in London in 2012, there's something you want to tell the world about how your country has changed.
You look at the cities that have hosted games recently and they've all got a story to tell. Sydney's trying to put itself on the map to ditch its slightly colonial outpost reputation. Similarly, Beijing is shaping up to try and be the next major political player on the world stage. So I think that there's definitely politics going on.
And there has been ever since the Nazis hosted the Olympics, hasn't there?
And it's always been a way of showing off and saying how great you are.
But I suppose if developing countries are priced out of it, then that's troubling for the Olympic ideal, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the only sort of big events to have been held outside of the sort of traditional Western world would perhaps be the 2010 Commonwealth Games in India, which wasn't a great success, and the 2010 World Cup in South Africa, which was okay but had a few problems. It was hugely over budget, and it wasn't the legacy hasn't been spectacular.
Yeah, now that's what Fikle Mbalula was referring to, wasn't it, when he said we are wiser? Do you think that, that they learn lessons from the 2010 World Cup?
It cost $15 billion or something to host the World Cup, and they've been given $300 million to host the Commonwealth, so you can see why they're not that keen, or they're not sure it's going to happen.
And I think that's got to be a big part of it, right? That these are no longer viewed as money spinners. There's all of the illusion that you can actually make money through tourism out of an Olympic Games or a World Cup. That's got to have been destroyed by now.
There's too much information now proving the opposite. If you look at Sydney, they had a GDP downturn after the Olympics.
Yeah.
You suck all the interest in during the Games, and then there's it's like a tidal wave. It all disappears out of the bay again for the next few years.
And simultaneously, you got to think that there's a degree of disillusionment about corruption in FIFA and the state-sponsored doping that's kind of afflicted the Olympic Games. So the sporting contests as well have been undermined.
Everyone wants to go to the party, but no one really wants to host it. Everyone's going to turn up, take drugs and leave, and leave you with a massive clean-up bill.
How did it shape up for Rio in the end? Because that's a story that we were all following, I think, in the build-up to those two big sporting events. I haven't really heard anything since the summer.
The Maracanã Stadium is derelict, absolute dog's biscuit, dog's breakfast.
It's a game I play at public school.
A lot of the venues have just been left. It's a bit of a disaster, really.
There was that time when America basically wanted it all the time because they said we could put on a show. And that's what worries me, is that these things have become such a show rather than about the sport and prowess that's on display.
Yeah, and that's a function of the money that's in it. So construction companies stand to make fortunes, therefore it's the big construction companies that want to get involved, and you're straight away you're into developed Western nations, so you can have that kind of infrastructure already there. So yeah, the whole thing's become a sort of a gravy train.
And has there been a desire in the Olympic Games Committee and in the Commonwealth Games Committee to go out to developing countries, not as a sort of, sport bringing the world together, I'd like to teach the world to sing kind of thing, but actually just hold the Olympics in Beijing, you're going to get a load more Chinese people watching the Olympics. Hold the Commonwealth Games in South Africa, you're going to get a load of Africans watching the Commonwealth Games.
There has been that. I'm not sure their motivation is very noble. You look at Qatar. I think one of the reasons FIFA chose Qatar for the World Cup was probably to do with their own back pockets.
What's been going on with Qatar, by the way? I haven't had an update on that either.
They've gone on.
I'm going to you for all my sport updates.
Well, it hasn't been in the news recently, has it?
It hasn't.
So perhaps too many people haven't died.
Yeah.
There's a lesson from Montreal in '76, which didn't pay off its debts until 2006 from that games, and was left, basically the city was almost ruined. So there have been successes. Barcelona was one as well, and London. But it's always over budget, and it's just unaffordable unless you're a big westernised nation, I think, now.
Well, not every country has a football club like West Ham that deserves a stadium of that scale.
Well, yeah, that will go down in the negatives on the legacy score sheet.
And finally, Arion, your turn. What story have you brought with you?
So if you like strudel and schnitzel, you're going to love the newly crowned best city in the world.
European cities are the best places to live, according to a new report from human resources consulting firm Mercer. The report says despite recent security issues, social issues, and subpar economic outlooks, European cities still outrank much of the rest of the world. According to Mercer's 18th Quality of Life survey, the Austrian capital of Vienna ranked at the top of the list worldwide for the 7th straight time. Zurich, Auckland, Munich, and Vancouver rounded out the top 5.
Matt Moreno there reporting for Newsy. You can find the whole report at aol.co.uk. Arion, right, Vienna, a lovely place to visit. What's so great about it that you want to live there?
I can't work it out. I think that's the reason that I find this whole report kind of interesting. You look at that list, not just Vienna, but then rounding out the top 5, you've got Zurich, Auckland, Munich and Vancouver. I mean, they're very much cities of a certain kind.
Oh, go on, spell out what kind.
Boring cities.
Boring.
Boring cities.
Munich is fantastic.
Oh, no, it's boring.
No, Munich
falls
a great
into the same
city.
category.
But that's the trouble with these lists. You say it's boring, I say it's a fantastic city. I've had fantastic times in Munich.
But
Can't remember most of them, but
is it akin to or better than a Berlin? I suppose this is my question. Why is it that your New Yorks, your Londons, your Tokyos don't make these lists in terms of the best cities to live in?
Because they're looking at all kinds of metrics that aren't the same ones you'd use if you were describing a place that was exciting, or if you were asking people to describe a place that had a fashionable art scene, or they're looking for places that have good schools, cheap housing, decent food, and that does, I guess, sort of often come together to create a slightly bland environment.
I think that's right, but surely if we're trying to assess quality of life, we need to take into account those things. And I think that that's the upsetting thing. And, look, this was a report that was compiled by a human resources consulting firm trying to assess the kinds of cities that you should recompense your employees for if they're living in a state of hardship versus living in a state of comparative, social bliss. But there's many similar surveys that throw up the same results, such as the UN Happiness Report, which really has the same set of candidates, your Scandinavias, your Western Europes, and then Australia and New Zealand.
There's many types of survey, and there's many types of city as well, but there's only 2 in the top 20 on this list, as far as I could tell. I think there were 7 of them which are English-speaking Commonwealth cities, like Melbourne, Auckland, and Canadian places, and the rest of them are all sort of ancient European places with a cathedral and some nice architecture and a good bus service.
Exactly.
But none of them are in Britain.
No, and none of them in the US, and none of them are in Asia, and none of them are in Africa as well. There's only basically 3 places they are.
So, why?
Well, because there's obviously been one set of criteria which this company has looked at, which doesn't take into account the views of pretty much everyone else in the world, apart from what they like.
Well, it's looking at health and well-being. I mean, in your sensational weekends in Munich, Elizabeth, were you living a clean life? Was health and well-being top of the list?
No one yet.
But if that's what makes people happy, I don't know if that's one of the things they looked into. That's important, isn't it? Happiness is important.
And I think that is the question, whether the criteria that they have chosen are the things that actually do relate to what makes people happy. I think that one of the criteria that they did look into was GDP per capita, when they should have been looking at that Bavarian beer stuff and how many pubs per capita there are. And I think that this is the question, and when we look back on all of these studies, this great body of studies from a future vantage, we'll find it fascinating that the assessment was being made on these measures of security and transport and not on where was fun to go out at night.
Yeah, but it's important. I mean, the practical details of life are important, aren't they? The Sunday Times did one of these this week as well, didn't they? Looking at places in Britain that were attractive to live. And that was all about sort of how much square foot you can get within a commuter distance of London and whether the school was Ofsted rated. But those are the practicalities of life. You're not going to say, and they've got a great cocktail bar.
Sure, but would you rather live in, say, Zurich than, I don't know, Beijing?
It's a grandiose step to say that because you can buy X amount of land with X amount of money, that's the best place, full stop, in the country or the world. It's just a value judgment based on economics, isn't it? It's not based on anything beyond that.
So what are the lasting repercussions of a story like this, then, if they come along every day?
I think the fascinating thing about it is that it's going to be a useful barometer of what a particular age found fascinating, valuable, useful, and ultimately livable. And it looks as though, to me at least, security is going to be seen as the number one factor that people considered. They wanted comfort, they wanted a certain amount of good schools on their front doorstep, and then they want peace and quiet. And maybe that is an accurate statement of what this age is about, but I think it doesn't capture, say, what's interesting and exciting about the cities that actually draw people in to live in.
No, and that is an interesting point. I guess if you'd have looked back at these kind of surveys from the 1980s, people would have had very different answers, wouldn't they? The kind of place they want to live. And with that, we wrap up this week's edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jonathan Harwood, Arion McNicoll and Elizabeth Carr-Ellis. For more from The Week, you need to visit theweek.co.uk, download The Weekday, which is our free iPhone app, or, of course, get the magazine direct to your door. Go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And you can hear brand new episodes of this show for free simply by hitting subscribe in your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.